Fluorescent hospital lights buzz with a sound that drills straight into your skull. At 2 a.m, the emergency room is a purgatory of bad coffee, exhausted nurses, and quiet despair. The phone call lasted barely 10 seconds. She didn't ask him to come. She just stated a fact. 20 minutes later, the sliding double doors parted. He didn't bring his men. He didn't carry a weapon. He just brought a silence heavy enough to suffocate the room. Adrian Cross did not sleep. Sleep was a vulnerability, a temporary death he couldn't afford. At 2 a.m, his penthouse office was a tomb of glass and steel overlooking the sprawl of Chicago. The city below was a grid of amber streetlights and moving shadows, a machine that never stopped grinding. Adrian sat behind a desk of reclaimed mahogany, a ledger open in front of him, a glass of lukewarm rye whiskey resting near his knuckles. He wasn't a man given to excess. He wore a simple black button-down, sleeves rolled up to the forearms, revealing the faded ink of a life he had supposedly left behind. He was running numbers, legitimate numbers, shipping manifests, warehouse acquisitions, real estate developments. The violent, bloody machinery of the Cross Syndicate was buried deep beneath layers of LLCs and corporate tax filings, and the person who buried those bodies, figuratively speaking, was his secretary. Audrey Miller. She was not a woman from his world. She didn't grow up dodging bullets in the South Side, and she didn't have uncles who went to federal prison for racketeering. She was a Cornell graduate with a degree in accounting and a mind like a steel trap. 5 years ago, she walked into his legitimate front company for an interview. 3 months in, she found the discrepancies in the books. Instead of going to the police, she walked into his office, placed a corrected ledger on his desk, and told him his previous accountant was stealing from him. She saved him $2 million and a federal indictment. He offered her a job on the spot. Double the salary, unparalleled benefits, and one ironclad rule. You see everything, you fix the math, and you never ask where the cash comes from. She agreed. For 5 years, she had been the only indispensable moving part in his empire. She managed his schedule, laundered his capital, and stood as a firewall between him and the chaos of the streets. She was professional to a fault. Hair always tied back, suits always tailored but conservative, a quiet, unassuming force. Then, the private line on his desk rang. It was a heavy, black, analog phone. It wasn't connected to a switchboard. Only 3 people had the number. 2 of them were currently running a port operation in Miami. The third was supposed to be asleep in her townhouse in Lincoln Park. Adrian stared at the ringing phone. A low, cold hum started in the base of his spine. He picked up the receiver. He didn't say hello. "Mr. Cross," Audrey's voice. But it was wrong. The crisp, authoritative tone she used to command his lieutenants was gone. It was replaced by something thin, brittle. "Audrey." Adrian's voice was gravel, quiet and flat. "I'm at St. Jude's Memorial," she said. A harsh intake of breath rattled through the speaker. "I apologize for calling this line. My cell phone was destroyed. I used the hospital phone. The police want to take a statement, and I didn't know who else to call." She didn't sound panicked. She sounded hollow. That was worse. "St. Jude's," Adrian repeated. "I can take a cab home after they finish the stitches. I just needed to inform you I might be late for the 9 a.m. briefing." She was rambling. Shock. "Stay," Adrian said. He hung up the phone. He didn't slam it. He placed it down with terrifying care. He didn't call his security detail. He didn't wake his enforcers. This wasn't a syndicate issue yet. This was his secretary, alone in a public triage center in the middle of the night. He grabbed his keys, threw on a dark wool overcoat, and took the private elevator down to the garage. The drive across the city was a blur of wet asphalt and red lights he didn't stop for. The rain had started, a miserable, freezing drizzle that smeared the street lamps across his windshield. The engine of his Audi sedan growled as he pushed it 80 miles an hour down Michigan Avenue. His mind was a sterile, tactical space. He catalogued the enemies who might want to send a message. The Russians in the North Ward, the remnants of the old Irish mobs, a disgruntled contractor. But no one went after Audrey. She was a civilian. In the intricate, brutal chess game of the Chicago underworld, you didn't touch the accountants. It was bad for business. It invited a kind of retaliation that no one wanted to survive. If someone had touched her deliberately, the rules were suspended. Adrian pulled into the emergency drop-off zone at St. Jude's, leaving the car idling in a tow-away zone. He didn't care. He walked through the sliding automatic doors. The heat of the waiting room hit him first, followed by the smell. Antiseptic, stale sweat, and cheap coffee. The room was crowded with the night's casualties. A man nursing a broken hand, a mother holding a feverish child, a pair of cops leaning against a vending machine, looking bored. Adrian didn't rush. He didn't scan the room frantically. He walked with a heavy, measured gait directly toward the triage desk. People moved out of his way without realizing why. He had the kind of presence that commanded space. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes as hard and unreadable as flint. The nurse behind the reinforced glass was typing away, looking exhausted. "Audrey Miller," Adrian said. The nurse sighed, not looking up. "Family only past the double doors, sir. You'll have to wait until she's discharged." Adrian didn't argue. He reached into his coat, pulled out a heavy platinum money clip, peeled off 5 crisp $100 bills, and slid them under the gap in the glass. The nurse stopped typing. She looked at the money, then up at Adrian's face. Whatever she saw in his expression, the absolute, uncompromising deadliness in his jawline, made her swallow hard. "Bay 4, she whispered, sliding the money under a clipboard. "Down the hall on the right." Adrian walked past the security doors. He didn't look back. The ER floor was a chaotic symphony of beeping monitors, hushed voices, and the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum. Adrian navigated the narrow corridors, his eyes tracking the bay numbers painted in faded blue on the walls. 1, 2, 3, 4. He stopped at the edge of this curtain. It was pulled back just enough to see inside. Audrey sat on the edge of the gurney. Adrian's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Her usually immaculate appearance was gone. Her cream-colored silk blouse was torn at the shoulder, stained with a mix of grease, street dirt, and dark, dried blood. Her left arm was strapped tightly against her chest in a temporary sling, but it was her face that made the cold hum in Adrian's spine turn into a roaring inferno. A jagged laceration ran along her left temple, currently being stitched by a young resident. Her cheekbone was swollen, blooming into a violent shade of purple and black. Her eyes were dull, staring straight ahead at the white wall. She looked fragile. Audrey Miller, the woman who had single-handedly shut down a multi-million-dollar money-laundering sting by finding a loophole in a warrant, looked like she could blow away in a stiff wind. 2 uniformed police officers stood at the foot of the bed, holding notepads. "Ms. Miller, we need you to focus," one of the cops was saying, his tone impatient. "You said a black SUV ran you off the road. Do you remember the make? A license plate?" Audrey blinked slowly. "I told you. It was dark. They didn't just run me off the road. They boxed my car in. 2 men got out." "And then what?" the cop pressed. "Did they ask for your purse? Your keys?" "They didn't ask for anything," Audrey said, her voice trembling slightly. They smashed the driver's side window with a bat. They dragged me out. One of them threw me against the hood. He said—" She hesitated, her eyes flickering. He said, "Tell your boss his books are closed." The officers exchanged a look. "Your boss? Who do you work for, Miss Miller?" Adrian stepped into the bay. He didn't announce himself. He simply occupied the space. The air in the small cubicle seemed to instantly drop 10 degrees. The two cops turned, hands instinctively drifting toward their utility belts at the sudden intrusion. The young doctor paused, needle hovering over Audrey's temple. Audrey's head snapped up. When her eyes found Adrian, the dullness vanished. For a split second, a profound, gut-wrenching relief washed over her features, immediately followed by the ironclad mask of professionalism she always wore around him. "Mr. Cross," she said. Her voice was raspy. "You didn't have to come." Adrian ignored the cops. He ignored the doctor. He walked straight to the side of the gurney. He looked down at her. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't ask if she was okay. She obviously wasn't. He looked at their bruising on her jaw. He looked at the way her ribs hitched when she breathed. He catalogued every injury, filing it away not as a tragedy, but as a debt that would be collected. He reached out. His large, calloused hand hesitated for a fraction of a second before gently brushing a stray lock of blood-matted hair away from her uninjured eye. The touch was impossibly light. Audrey stopped breathing for a second. "Excuse me, buddy," the older cop barked, stepping forward. "This is an active police interview. You need to step back. Who are you?" Adrian slowly turned his head. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. "I am the boss she was referring to," Adrian said. "My name is Adrian Cross. She is my chief financial officer. And this interview is over." The older cop scoffed, puffing his chest out. "Yeah? Well, Mr. Cross, unless you're her lawyer, you don't dictate when we're done. We have an aggravated assault here. You have a mugging," Adrian corrected smoothly, his voice a low, lethal baritone. "A random act of violence in a city plagued by it. Miss Miller is in shock. She gave you what she remembers. You will file your report in the morning. Now, you are going to leave this cubicle so the doctor can finish his work, and then I am taking my employee home." "Listen here," the cop started, pulling his radio. Adrian stepped into the officer's personal space. He didn't make a sudden move. He just stood there, towering over the man. Adrian's eyes locked onto the officer's badge number. "Officer Riley." Adrian read the nameplate. He leaned in, lowering his voice so only the two cops could hear. "You work out of the 12th precinct. Your captain is Thomas Vargas. I had dinner with Tommy 2 nights ago at the Palmer house. We discussed the Union Pension Fund. If you would like to continue harassing a traumatized woman, I can call Tommy right now and we can discuss your pension. Or you can take your notepad, walk out into the rain, and close this file." The silence that followed was heavy. Officer Riley swallowed. He recognized the name. More importantly, he recognized the man. You didn't work the streets of Chicago for more than 5 years without hearing whispers about Adrian Cross. The man who owned half the real estate in the South Loop and supposedly commanded a small army of ghosts. Riley took a step back. He tapped his partner's arm. "We have what we need for the preliminary report. Have a good night, Ms. Miller." They left quickly, the curtain swinging shut behind them. The young resident doctor was sweating. I just need to finish these 3 stitches, sir." Adrian nodded once. "Do it well." He stood by the gurney, his posture rigid. Audrey watched him. She knew him well enough to read the microscopic shifts in his demeanor, the rigid set of his shoulders, the cold, dead look in his eyes. He was furious. Not at her. At the world that had dared to touch her. She opened her mouth to apologize again, to explain how she was ambushed at the stoplight near her neighborhood. Adrian met her gaze. He shook his head once, just a fraction of a millimeter. Don't speak. The message was clear. There was no need for words. Words were cheap. Words were for people who needed explanations. He already understood everything that mattered. She was hurt. Someone had hurt her. The rest was just logistics. Done, the doctor said, snipping the thread. She needs rest. Painkillers for the ribs. They're bruised, not broken. Keep the arm elevated. She should follow up with a primary care physician in a week. She will, Adrian said. Can she walk? I can walk, Audrey interrupted, her pride flaring slightly. She shifted her legs off the side of the bed. Her feet hit the linoleum, and a sharp spike of pain shot through her bruised ribs. She swayed, her knees buckling instantly. Before she could fall, Adrian caught her. His arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. He was solid, unyielding, smelling of cedar wood, winter rain, and a faint trace of expensive whiskey. It was the closest she had ever been to him in 5 years. The heat radiating off his body was shocking. I've got you, he muttered, the first words he had spoken directly to her since he entered the room. He didn't ask for a wheelchair. He simply supported most of her weight, tucking her against his side, and guided her out of the bay. The walk through the hospital corridors felt endless, but Audrey felt strangely untethered, floating on a wave of adrenaline and the dull ache of the painkillers the doctor had given her earlier. She leaned heavily into Adrian. He adjusted his grip, his hand resting firmly on her hip, holding her upright with effortless strength. He didn't speak to the staff as they left. He didn't look at anyone. He moved with a singular purpose, cutting through the hospital like a shark through deep water. When the automatic doors slid open, the frigid Chicago wind slammed into them. Audrey shivered violently, her torn silk blouse offering zero protection. Adrian stopped abruptly. Without a word, he let go of her waist with one hand, shrugged off his heavy wool overcoat, and draped it over her shoulders. It swamped her frame. It was thick and heavy, lined with silk, trapping his body heat around her like a cocoon. "Mr. Cross," she managed to say, her teeth chattering. "You'll freeze." "Walk," he commanded softly. He guided her to the idling Audi. He opened the passenger door, helping her ease into the leather seat, making sure her injured arm wasn't bumped against the doorframe. He closed the door with a solid thunk, isolating her in the quiet, heated interior of the car. A moment later, he slid into the driver's seat. He was in his shirt sleeves, the cold rain dampening his dark hair, but he didn't seem to notice the temperature. He threw the car into gear, and they pulled away from the curb. The silence inside the cabin was absolute. The only sound was the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers and the hum of the tires on wet asphalt. Audrey stared out the window, watching the blur of streetlights. The shock was beginning to wear off, leaving behind a cold, creeping terror. "Tell your boss his books are closed." She had always known who Adrian Cross was. She wasn't naive. She knew the shell companies were fronts for gambling rings, protection rackets, and smuggling routes. But it had always been numbers on a screen to her. Abstract data. She balanced the ledgers, she filed the taxes, she kept the IRS away. She had never seen the blood. Tonight, the violence of his world had reached out and grabbed her by the throat. She turned her head slowly to look at him. His profile was illuminated by the dashboard lights, harsh, angular, merciless. His eyes were locked on the road, his grip on the leather steering wheel so tight his knuckles were bone white. "They were waiting for me," she said. The silence was too loud. She needed to break it. Adrian didn't look at her. I know. It was a message. I know. Mr. Cross. She swallowed, her throat dry. I can't go back to my townhouse. If they know my route, they know where I live. You're not going to your townhouse. He took a sharp right turn, heading away from Lincoln Park. He was driving toward the North Shore, toward his private estate. I'm a liability now, Audrey said, the harsh truth of her corporate mind taking over. If they are targeting me to get to you, keeping me around makes you vulnerable. I have sufficient funds. I can relocate. I can resign. The tires screeched as Adrian suddenly slammed on the brakes, pulling the heavy car to a halt on the shoulder of a deserted, rain-slicked road. The sudden stop threw Audrey forward against the seatbelt, making her gasp in pain. Adrian threw the car into park. He turned to face her. His expression was a thundercloud. For a terrifying second, Audrey thought she had overstepped, that the ruthless Mafia boss had finally grown tired of his accountant. He unbuckled his seatbelt and leaned across the center console. He invaded her space, bringing his face inches from hers. His dark eyes searched her battered face, tracing the line of the bandage on her temple, the bruise on her jaw. "Do not ever say that word to me again," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying, vibrating intensity. "What word?" she whispered. "Resign." He held her gaze, refusing to let her look away. "You don't resign, Audrey. You don't run. And you are not a liability." "They used me to send a threat," she argued weakly. "And I will use them to send a massacre," he replied instantly, without a shred of hesitation. It wasn't a boast. It was a simple statement of fact. They touched what is mine. They breached the wall. What is mine? The words hung in the air between them, heavy and loaded. He didn't say my employee. He didn't say my secretary. Audrey stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. The cynical, calculated barrier she kept between them suddenly felt very fragile. She realized, looking into his eyes, that his absolute silence in the hospital hadn't been indifference. It had been restraint. He was holding back a rage so profound it would have burned the building down. He slowly pulled back, retreating to his side of the car. He put the vehicle back in drive and pulled out onto the road. "Dr. Orris is waiting at my compound," Adrian said, his tone returning to a flat, businesslike calm. "He has an X-ray machine and proper medical supplies. You will stay in the East Wing guest suite until I deem it safe for you to leave." "And when will that be?" she asked softly. Adrian looked at the road ahead, his eyes narrowing at the rain. "When there is no one left alive who remembers your name." The rest of the drive passed in a profound, shifting silence. It was no longer the silence of an employer and his staff. It was something deeper, grounded in shared trauma and a dark, unspoken loyalty. They passed through the towering wrought-iron gates of the Cross estate 20 minutes later. Armed guards stepped out of the shadows, recognizing the vehicle and waving them through. The massive stone manor loomed in the darkness, isolated and impenetrable. Adrian parked under the portico. He walked around, opening her door. This time he didn't just support her. He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her out of the car entirely. "I can walk," she protested weakly, though she didn't fight it. "Shut up, Audrey," he murmured, carrying her up the stone steps. Inside the grand foyer, Dr. Orris, an older, discreet man who owed his medical license and his life to the Cross family, was waiting with a medical bag. Adrian ignored him, carrying Audrey straight up the sweeping mahogany staircase to the East Wing. He brought her into a massive, opulent guest room, gently setting her down on the edge of the king-sized bed. He pulled his overcoat off her shoulders, careful of her arm. "Orris will look at you now," Adrian said, stepping back toward the door. "Get some sleep. We will talk business tomorrow." Adrian. It was the first time in 5 years she had used his first name. He stopped in the doorway, his hand on the brass knob. He looked back at her. "Thank you," she said. He didn't smile. He just nodded once. "Sleep." He closed the door behind him. Adrian stood in the empty hallway for a long time. He pulled a silver cigarette case from his pocket, lighting a cigarette. He took a long drag, letting the smoke fill his lungs, feeling the cold, mechanical rhythm of his pulse. He pulled out his burner phone. He dialed a number. It rang once. "Boss," a gruff voice answered. "Wake the boys up," Adrian said, staring at the closed door of Audrey's room. "We're going hunting." The rain turned to sleet by 4 in the morning. It hit the corrugated tin roof of the Southside chop shop like handfuls of gravel. Inside, the air tasted of motor oil, stale beer, and the distinct metallic tang of fear. Adrian Cross stood in the center of the concrete floor. He still wore the damp dress shirt from the hospital, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows. He wasn't holding a weapon. He didn't need to. The 6 men surrounding the perimeter of the garage, his men, were armed heavily enough to take a small municipality. In front of Adrian, kneeling in a puddle of hydraulic fluid, was a man named Ricky. Ricky was a mid-level contractor who specialized in stolen vehicles and intimidation. Behind him sat the scorched, stripped chassis of a black SUV. "I'm going to ask you once," Adrian said. His voice was a flat, conversational murmur that barely carried over the drumming sleet. "Who paid for the rental?" Ricky spat a mouthful of blood onto the concrete. His left eye was already swelling shut. "Man, I told you. I just procure the rides. It was a blind drop. Cash in a duffel. I don't ask names." Adrian looked at Carter, his lieutenant. Carter was a man built like a bank vault, with a face that looked like it had been reconstructed from memory. Carter nodded slowly, stepping forward with a heavy iron lug wrench. "Wait, wait!" Ricky panicked, holding his hands up. "I swear to God, Cross, it was a burner phone, a voice modulator. They just said they needed a heavy vehicle to box in a sedan on a residential route. And you didn't think to ask who the target was," Adrian stated. "Not my business." It became your business. Adrian took a slow, measured step forward. His leather shoes crunched on the grit of the garage floor. "You provided the cage they used to trap a woman who balances my books. You facilitated a breach of my perimeter. You think cash in a duffel absolves you of the logistics?" Adrian crouched down. He was now eye level with the kneeling man. He didn't yell. He didn't snarl. He spoke with the chilling patience of a teacher explaining a fatal math error. "The men you leased that car to put a baseball bat through a window. They put hands on my employee. They bruised her ribs and split her temple." Adrian tilted his head. "I am going to take my time dismantling the people who ordered it. But I need a thread to pull. Give me the thread, Ricky." Ricky's breath hitched. He looked at the cold, dead certainty in Adrian's eyes and realized there was no negotiation. "The drop," he stammered. "The cash drop for the SUV. The bills were wrapped in old casino bands. The Royal Crown in Hammond." Adrian stood up slowly. The Royal Crown. An old gambling boat managed by the O'Bannon family. Irish remnants who had been bleeding territory for a decade. "Carter," Adrian said, turning his back on the kneeling man. "Yeah, boss? Burn the chassis. Break his hands. If he touches a steering wheel in this city again, bury him." Adrian walked out into the freezing sleet. He didn't look back to watch. He pulled out his phone, dialed a number, and waited. The violence was just a ledger balancing, a transaction of pain for pain. Now, He had the account number. Miles away, on the North Shore estate, Audrey woke to the sterile scent of medical gauze and the deep, rich smell of old wood. She opened her eyes, immediately regretting it. The room spun, a dull throb radiating from her left temple to the base of her neck. She tried to sit up, and a sharp, breathtaking spike of agony shot through her ribs. She gasped, falling back against the heavy silk pillows. "Don't force it, Miss Miller." Audrey turned her head carefully. Dr. Aris sat in a leather armchair by the window, a book open in his lap. The morning light filtering through the heavy blackout curtains was grey and bruised. "What time is it?" she rasped. Her throat felt like sandpaper. "Just past 8, the doctor replied, closing his book. He stood and approached the bed, clicking a pen light. "Follow the light, please. Good. Your pupils are reacting normally. The concussion is mild, but the bruising on your intercostal muscles will make breathing uncomfortable for a few weeks." Audrey looked down at herself. Someone, presumably a female staff member, had changed her out of her ruined clothes. She was wearing a soft, oversized grey t-shirt. Her arm was secured in a clean, professional sling. "Where is he?" she asked. Dr. Aris paused, checking her pulse. He didn't need clarification on the pronoun. Mr. Cross had business to attend to in the city. Business. She knew what that meant. She closed her eyes. The memory of the bat shattering her window flashed in her mind, followed by the terrifying, suffocating silence of the men dragging her out of the car. Then it was replaced by the memory of Adrian's face in the car. "I will use them to send a massacre." "I need my phone," Audrey said, forcing herself to sit up, ignoring the burning in her side. "I need my laptop." "You need rest," Aris corrected gently. "Mr. Cross left strict instructions." "I don't care about his instructions," Audrey interrupted, her voice gaining a fraction of its usual corporate steel. "Someone came after me to get to him. If they know my routine, they know my accounts. I need to secure the remote servers." "Ms. Miller, please." The heavy oak door of the bedroom swung open. Adrian stood in the frame. The immediate shift in the room's atmospheric pressure was palpable. He looked exhausted. His jaw was covered in dark stubble. The pristine black button-down he had worn the night before was wrinkled, and the cuffs were unbuttoned. He looked from Dr. Aris to Audrey, taking in her rigid, upright posture and pale face. "Aris, leave us," Adrian said. The doctor packed his bag without a word and slipped out, closing the door softly behind him. Adrian walked to the foot of the bed. He stopped there, creating a physical boundary. He didn't ask how she felt. He looked at the fresh bandages, his eyes lingering on the dark purple bruising flowering along her jawline. "You're awake," he said. "You went out," she replied, her eyes dropping to his hands. His right hand was resting on the carved wooden footboard. The knuckles were raw, the skin split across the middle and ring fingers. There was a faint smear of something dark and rusted near his cuff. She wasn't naive. She filed the payouts for the cleanup crews. But seeing the physical evidence of his brutality up close, knowing it was done because of her, sent a complicated, twisting knot into her stomach. "I handled a logistics issue," Adrian said smoothly, following her gaze and casually sliding his hands into his trouser pockets. "You should be lying down." "My ribs are bruised, Adrian. My brain isn't broken," she snapped. The painkillers were making her reckless, stripping away the professional distance she usually maintained. "I need a secure terminal. They told me to tell you the books were closed. That wasn't just a generic mob threat. They used corporate terminology. They know what I do." Adrian's jaw tightened. "I am handling it." "You are handling the street," she shot back. "I handle the numbers. If there is a leak in the financial architecture, a bullet won't fix it. I need my laptop." Adrian stared at her. He had employed her for 5 years. He had seen her stare down hostile corporate auditors without blinking. He had watched her negotiate multi-million-dollar real estate acquisitions with ice in her veins. But sitting in his guest bed, bruised, battered, and wearing an oversized shirt, demanding access to a server so she could fight a mob war with a spreadsheet. It was the most formidable he had ever seen her. He slowly pulled an encrypted tablet from the inside pocket of his jacket and tossed it onto the mattress. It landed softly near her knee. "It's slaved to the main server in my office," Adrian said. "Biometric login. You have complete access." Audrey looked at the tablet, then up at him. "Thank you." "The O'Bannons," Adrian said quietly. Audrey froze. Her mind instantly accessed the mental filing cabinet of the syndicate's rivals. "The Irish? They don't have the capital to launch an offensive. We bought out their last 2 legitimate shipping fronts in April. They paid for the hit vehicle using cash wrappers from the Royal Crown Casino. It's an old operation, barely profitable. But it's theirs. That doesn't make sense," Audrey muttered, wincing as she reached for the tablet with her good arm. "They are financially starved. A direct attack on me risks a total war they can't afford to fund." "Desperation makes men stupid," Adrian countered. "No," Audrey said, shaking her head. She powered on the tablet, scanning her thumbprint. "Desperation makes men predictable. Stupid is something else. If they spent capital to hire contractors to ambush me, they expect a return on investment." Adrian watched her. The way her eyes darted across the screen, the fierce concentration that wiped away the vulnerability of her injuries. He felt an unfamiliar, dangerous pull in his chest. He was used to protecting assets. He wasn't used to an asset demanding to fight alongside him. "Find it, Audrey," he said softly. "Find what they think they took." By noon, the rain had stopped, leaving the estate wrapped in a thick, suffocating fog. Inside the East Wing, the silence was broken only by the rapid, rhythmic tapping of Audrey's right hand on the tablet screen. She had refused to stay in bed. Against Iris's protests and Adrian's silent disapproval, she had relocated to a velvet armchair by the window, her injured arm resting on a pillow, the tablet balanced on her knees. She had been staring at lines of code, offshore routing numbers, and shell company tax filings for 4 hours. Adrian hadn't left the room. He sat at a small writing desk in the corner, reviewing physical security reports, but his attention rarely left her. He was accustomed to solitude. He preferred it. But the thought of leaving her alone in the room, even surrounded by 40 armed guards on the perimeter, made his skin crawl. "I need coffee," she announced suddenly, breaking the quiet. Iris said no caffeine. "It interferes with the muscle relaxants," Adrian replied, without looking up from his papers. "Iris isn't trying to reverse engineer a money laundering funnel through a casino," she retorted. She rubbed her eyes, a sigh escaping her lips. "I'm hitting a wall. The Royal Crown's legitimate books are clean. Too clean. They claim a net loss of 10% year over year, which justifies their tax breaks, but their operating costs don't match the depreciation of their assets." Adrian closed his folder. He stood up and walked over to her, pulling up a heavy wooden chair and sitting across from her. Their knees almost touched. "Translate that from accountant to English," he said. Audrey shifted, acutely aware of his proximity. The scent of him, rain, cold outside air, and an undercurrent of something deeply masculine and dangerous, was distracting. "It means," she said, steadying her voice, "they are moving money off the books, but they aren't hiding it well. To run a ghost operation, you need a secondary ledger. I've audited our entire network. We haven't touched their accounts. We starved their shipping, yes, but we never touched the casino. We didn't need to. It's a dying dinosaur, Adrian said. Exactly. Audrey leaned forward, wincing slightly. So why target me? Why tell you the books are closed? Unless... She stopped, her eyes widening. She furiously tapped a sequence on the screen, pulling up a massive encrypted spreadsheet. Unless what? Adrian prompted, his voice low. 3 weeks ago, Audrey said, her breathing shallow. You asked me to review the acquisition of the port warehouses in the South Loop, a commercial real estate buy. I remember. You finalized the escrow. I finalized the escrow, but I also audited the previous owner's tenant contracts to ensure we weren't inheriting liabilities. There was a ghost tenant, a shell company called Apex Logistics, renting a defunct storage space for an exorbitant monthly fee. It looked like a classic wash operation. I voided the lease and flagged the account for closure. Adrian's eyes darkened. Who owned Apex Logistics? Audrey turned the tablet around so he could see. I traced the LLC through 3 Delaware proxies. It dead ends at a holding company registered to a Liam O'Bannon. The silence in the room became absolute. They weren't trying to send a message about territory, Audrey whispered, the realization chilling her blood. They were using our newly acquired warehouses to wash their casino money. When I voided the lease and closed the accounts, I didn't just shut down a tenant. I severed their primary laundering artery. I trapped their liquid capital. Adrian stared at the screen. The tactical map in his head instantly realigned. The O'Bannons weren't just angry, they were financially suffocating. Audrey hadn't just insulted them, she had unknowingly put a tourniquet on their throat. How much capital? Adrian asked, his tone deadly quiet. Based on the routing history, Audrey swallowed hard. Over $6 million. It's sitting in an escrow limbo, because I triggered a fraud hold when I closed the LLC. Adrian slowly leaned back in his chair. He looked at the woman sitting in front of him, bruised, battered, in pain and utterly brilliant. She had done with a keystroke what his enforcers couldn't do with guns. She had crippled a rival family, and they had tried to break her for it. They want the hold released, Adrian surmised. They beat you to scare you into reversing the action. If I reverse it now, it flags the FBI, Audrey said quickly. The fraud alert is automated. The money is frozen. The only way to release it is for the holding company to verify their legitimate tax status in person, which they can't do because they are a cartel. They don't know that, Adrian said. They think you're just a mob accountant holding their cash hostage, so they will come again. She looked down at her lap, her hands trembling slightly. The bravado of the last 4 hours cracked, letting the reality of the situation flood back in. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was the target. She was the vault. Adrian saw the tremor in her hands. He didn't think. He reached across the small space between them and covered her trembling hand with his large, rough one. His grip was firm, anchoring her. Audrey stopped breathing. She looked at his hand, then up at his face. The cold, unreadable mask he wore for the world was gone. In his dark eyes, she saw a fierce, possessive fire that terrified her almost as much as the men with the bat. They will not come again, Adrian said. It wasn't a promise, it was a prophecy. Because by midnight tonight, the O'Bannon family will not have the infrastructure to hire a cab, let alone a hit squad. The war room was on the subterranean level of the estate. It didn't look like a mob hideout. It looked like a high-end corporate boardroom. Soundproofed walls, a massive mahogany conference table, and a wall of digital monitors currently displaying maps of Chicago's industrial sectors. By 8 in the evening, the room was filled with men. Carter stood near the monitors. 3 other lieutenants, Men with hard faces and tailored suits sat around the table. Adrian stood at the head of the table. Audrey sat to his immediate right. Her presence in the room had caused a brief, palpable ripple of shock among the lieutenants. The men knew Audrey. They respected her because they feared the control she had over their paychecks. But she belonged in the penthouse office, separated from the grit and the blood. Bringing her into the bunker, injured and wearing a sling, blurred lines that had never been crossed, Adrian didn't offer an explanation, which meant no one dared to ask for one. "The objective is the Royal Crown Casino," Adrian told the room, leaning his hands flat on the polished wood. "But we are not hitting the floor. We are not touching the civilians. We are gutting the operational capacity." He gestured to Audrey. She took a breath. The painkillers were wearing off, and the dull ache in her ribs was a constant reminder of why she was here. She tapped her tablet, and the main monitor shifted to display a complex organizational chart. "The casino is a front," Audrey said, her voice steady, echoing slightly in the large room. "Their cash on hand is low. Their liquid assets are frozen. That means they are operating on credit. They pay their security, their dock workers, and their contractors daily. Cash." She highlighted 3 locations on the map. "The Royal Crown doesn't hold its cash reserves on the boat. It's a federal liability," she continued, slipping effortlessly into her element. "Based on their utility payouts and security logs I pulled from the city grid, they are holding their cash in 3 off-site counting rooms disguised as payday loan fronts in Hammond." Carter let out a low whistle. "She found their piggy banks." "If you hit the boat, they rebuild," Audrey said, looking at the men around the table. "If you burn the counting rooms, you destroy their liquidity. By tomorrow morning, their own men will turn on them when the daily envelopes don't arrive. You don't need to fight an army. You just have to stop paying them." The lieutenants looked from the map to Audrey, and then to Adrian. The sheer, ruthless efficiency of the plan was staggering. It wasn't a mob war. It was a hostile corporate takeover executed with extreme prejudice. "Carter," Adrian said, his eyes scanning the map. "Take Team Alpha to location 1. Sullivan, you take location 2. I will take location 3. Audrey's head snapped toward him. "You're going?" "I am." "That's a tactical error," she said immediately, her corporate brain overriding her survival instinct. "You are the CEO. You don't do field work. If you are compromised, the entire organizational structure collapses." The room went dead silent. No one questioned Adrian Cross's deployment orders. Ever. The lieutenants held their breath. Adrian turned his head slowly, looking down at her. His expression was unreadable. "My employee was assaulted in the street. If I do not personally burn the assets of the men responsible, the street will think I have grown soft. This is not a board meeting, Ms. Miller. This is a reckoning." Audrey held his gaze. She didn't back down. "And if you get shot? Then you run the numbers, calculate the loss, and pay for a very expensive funeral," he replied smoothly. He turned back to the men. "Sync your comms. We leave in 10 minutes. Burn the cash. Seize the ledgers. Leave no one holding a weapon breathing." The men filed out rapidly, energized by the impending violence. Within minutes, the boardroom was empty, save for Adrian and Audrey. The heavy silence returned. Adrian walked over to a steel cabinet in the corner. He opened it, revealing a rack of tactical gear. He pulled out a dark Kevlar vest. Audrey watched him strip off his suit jacket and unbutton his dress shirt. She should have looked away, but she couldn't. His torso was corded with muscle, marred by an array of pale, jagged scars, testaments to a brutal past she had only ever seen the financial settlements for. A massive, intricate tattoo of a raven spread across his left pectoral, its wings wrapping over his shoulder. He pulled the Kevlar vest over his head, tightening the straps at his sides. He checked the action on a matte black Glock 19, his movements economical and practiced. "You're angry," Adrian said, not looking at her as he loaded a spare magazine into his belt. "I am logical," Audrey corrected, her voice tight. "Your personal involvement increases the risk profile exponentially." Adrian walked back to the table. He leaned over, placing a hand on either side of her chair, trapping her. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the gun oil and cedar. "I am not a CEO, Audrey," he said softly, his voice a dark, velvet threat. "I am a monster who learned how to wear a suit. Do not confuse the two. They touched you. They made you bleed. There is no ledger in the world that balances that equation without fire." He stared into her eyes, searching for the fear he knew should be there. He wanted her to be repulsed by him. He wanted her to remember what he was, to maintain the firewall between them. But Audrey didn't shrink away. She looked at the scars on his chest, at the gun on his hip, and finally, into his eyes. "Then don't miss," she whispered, a muscle feathered in Adrian's jaw. For a terrifying, breathless second, he leaned in closer. His gaze dropped to her mouth. The tension between them snapped, transforming from protective rage into something feral and electric. He pulled back abruptly, breaking the spell. "Lock the bunker doors from the inside," he commanded roughly. "Do not open them for anyone but me." He turned and walked out of the room. Audrey sat in the silence, listening to the heavy steel door slide shut, her heart hammering against her bruised ribs, realizing with terrifying clarity that she was no longer just an employee. She was his, and he was going to war for it. The Hammond storefront smelled of damp carpet and cheap bleach. The neon sign hanging in the barred window read "Fast Cash Advance" in a flickering, violent pink. Adrian sat in the driver's seat of an unmarked black sedan across the street. The engine was off. The rain had started again, a steady, freezing drizzle that slicked the asphalt. Through the windshield, he watched two men inside the brightly lit lobby. They weren't clerks. Clerks didn't wear tailored leather jackets that bulged at the hip, and they didn't chain smoke while staring at the front door. His earpiece cracked with a short burst of static. "Alpha is in position. Holding," Carter's voice murmured. "Beta is set," Sullivan echoed a second later. Adrian checked the luminous dial of his watch. 11:42 p.m. "Execute," Adrian said. He didn't wait to hear the confirmation. He stepped out of the vehicle into the freezing rain. He didn't run. He crossed the empty street with a heavy, measured stride. He reached under his jacket, drawing the Glock. He didn't bother racking the slide. He kept around, chambered. Time was a luxury in a breach, and sound was a warning. He lifted his left arm, wrapping the heavy wool of his sleeve over his fist, and drove it through the glass door of the storefront. The tempered glass shattered with a sharp, concussive crack, raining down in a cascade of glittering diamonds. Adrian reached through the jagged hole, unlocked the deadbolt, and pushed the frame open. The two men in the lobby spun around, hands diving for their waistbands. Adrian fired twice. He didn't aim for center mass. He didn't want a prolonged firefight. The suppressed weapon spit two dull, muffled cracks. The first man took a round in his right shoulder, the impact spinning him hard into a row of filing cabinets. The second took a round through his kneecap. He collapsed instantly, screaming, his hand dropping the pistol he had barely managed to draw. Adrian walked past them. He kicked the dropped weapon across the linoleum. He didn't look at the bleeding men. They were contractors. Grunts. The objective was behind the reinforced steel door at the back of the room. He raised his weapon and fired 3 rounds into the locking mechanism of the steel door. The metal warped and smoked. Adrian holstered his gun, stepped back, and delivered a devastating front kick to the handle. The door blew open, crashing against the drywall inside. The counting room was small, windowless, and illuminated by harsh overhead fluorescents. There was a table in the center. On it, bundled in rubber bands and stacked like bricks, was the lifeblood of the O'Bannon syndicate. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in small, untraceable bills. The lone man in the room, an older, balding accountant with a ledger open in front of him, threw his hands in the air, his face completely drained of color. "I'm just a counter," the man stammered, backing away from the table until his shoulders hit the wall. "I'm nobody." Adrian looked at the man, then at the money. "Take your coat," Adrian said. "Walk out the front door. If you look back, I will kill you." The man scrambled past Adrian, slipping on the shattered glass in the lobby as he bolted into the rainy night. Adrian was alone. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, heavy flare. He cracked the top. A blinding red chemical fire sputtered to life, hissing aggressively, filling the small room with the sharp, acidic stench of sulfur. He tossed it onto the center of the table. The bills caught instantly. The dry, aged paper flared up, a tower of green turning black in seconds. Adrian stood there for a long moment, watching the empire burn. The heat washed over his face, drying the cold rain on his skin. This was the cost of touching her. $1 million turning to ash for a single bruise on her jaw. He felt absolutely no regret. "Location 3 is dark," Adrian said into his earpiece, turning his back on the fire. "Alpha is dark. The vault is slag," Carter reported, the sound of sirens wailing faintly in the background of the transmission. "Beta is dark," Sullivan added. "We met resistance, 3 hostiles down, but the cache is gone." "Rendezvous," Adrian ordered. Miles away, locked deep beneath the earth in the silent, heavily fortified bunker, Audrey heard the transmission filter through the tactical radio on the mahogany table. "Location 3 is dark." She let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for an hour. Her shoulders slumped. The adrenaline that had kept her upright and focused began to drain away, leaving a cold, hollow exhaustion in its wake. She looked at the digital map on the wall monitor. The 3 red dots marking the payday loan fronts were gone. The O'Bannon family was broke. By tomorrow, they wouldn't be able to afford the gas to drive a hit squad into the city, let alone pay the men to pull the triggers. She had done this. Audrey stared at her own hands. They were pale, the nails neatly manicured. They didn't have calluses, and they didn't have blood on them. But they had typed the keystrokes that orchestrated the financial ruin of an entire criminal organization. She had drawn the map. Adrian had just followed it. She waited for the guilt to hit her. She waited for the moral revulsion she assumed a normal person was supposed to feel when they crossed the line from civilian to syndicate architect. It didn't come. Instead, there was only a profound, dark satisfaction. They had tried to break her. They had treated her as a weak link, a soft target to exploit, and she had dismantled them from a leather chair. She rested her head against the high back of the chair, closing her eyes. The pain in her ribs throbbed in time with her heartbeat. She was so incredibly tired, but she wouldn't sleep. She wouldn't leave the bunker. She had to see him walk back through that door. It was nearly 3 in the morning when the heavy locking mechanisms of the bunker door finally engaged. Audrey sat up straight, wincing as her bruised muscles protested the sudden movement. She watched the steel door slide open with a heavy, pneumatic hiss. Adrian walked in. He brought the smell of the outside world with him. Freezing rain, wet asphalt, the metallic tang of gun oil, and beneath it all, the harsh, unmistakable scent of chemical smoke. He was unharmed. That was the first thing Audrey's analytical mind registered. His movements were fluid, lacking the stiff, compensating gait of a man hiding an injury, but he looked utterly exhausted. The brutal, vibrating energy he had left with was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out weariness. He stopped just inside the door. He didn't speak. He looked at her sitting at the head of the conference table, the glow of the monitors casting shadows over her pale face and the stark white bandage on her temple. Slowly, Adrian stripped off the wet tactical jacket, dropping it onto the floor. He unstrapped the Kevlar vest, the Velcro tearing loudly in the quiet room, and let it fall beside the jacket. He was left in his wrinkled dress shirt, the sleeves pushed up, his forearms smeared with soot and ash. He unclipped the Glock from his belt and placed it on a side table. Only then did he look back at her. Audrey stood up. She did it carefully, favoring her injured side, but she refused to remain seated. "Are there casualties?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady in the large room. "None of ours," Adrian replied. His voice was gravelly, scraped raw by the cold air and smoke. "The money is gone. Their operations are entirely paralyzed. The police? They will find 3 burned-out storefronts. Given the neighborhoods, they'll chalk it up to local gang arson. By the time the O'Bannons figure out how to navigate the fallout, the territory will already be absorbed by the North Side crews." Adrian ran a hand over his face, rubbing the dark stubble on his jaw. "It's done, Audrey." He walked slowly toward the conference table. He didn't sit in a chair. He leaned his hip against the edge of the heavy mahogany wood, right next to where she was standing. He looked down at the floor, his broad shoulders rising and falling with a heavy sigh. Audrey watched him. The firewall that had existed between them for 5 years, the unwritten rule that she was the pristine, untouchable corporate face, and he was the violent reality, was gone. It had burned up in a Hammond counting room. She stepped closer to him. She didn't think about the boundaries. She just reacted to the exhaustion radiating from him. "You're bleeding?" she noted softly. Adrian looked down at his left hand. A shard of glass from the storefront door had sliced through the side of his palm. He hadn't even noticed it. A thin trail of dried blood ran down to his wrist. "It's nothing," he muttered. Audrey didn't argue. She turned, walking slowly over to the medical kit Dr. Orris had left on a side counter earlier that evening. She returned with a bottle of saline, a gauze pad, and tape. Adrian watched her approach. He didn't move away. He let her stand squarely in front of him. "Give me your hand," she instructed. He hesitated, then lifted his left hand. Audrey took it. Her grip was light, mindful of the cut, but firm. The contrast between her pale, clean fingers and his large, soot-stained hand was stark. She uncapped the saline with her good hand and poured it over the cut, washing away the blood and ash. Adrian didn't flinch at the sting. He wasn't looking at his hand. He was looking at her face. He studied the intense concentration in her eyes, the slight furrow of her brow, the way her hair fell around her shoulders, messy and unstyled. "You shouldn't have seen this," Adrian said quietly. The word sounded like a confession pulled from deep within his chest. "You shouldn't be down here. You belong in the glass office. You belong in the light." Audrey stopped taping the gauze. She didn't let go of his hand. She looked up, meeting his dark, unreadable gaze. "The light is an illusion, Adrian," she said. Her voice lacked its usual corporate polish. It was raw and deeply honest. "The glass office is funded by the blood you spill in the dark. I always knew that. I just pretended I didn't. Tonight." She paused, swallowing hard. "Tonight, I stopped pretending." "They forced you into it," he countered, his jaw tightening. "You acted out of survival. I won't let it happen again. Tomorrow, you can go back to the ledgers. You never have to touch this side of it again. No, The word was soft, but it carried absolute finality. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly. "No, I'm not going back behind the wall," Audrey said. She stepped an inch closer, standing directly in his space. "I severed a $6 million artery tonight. I tracked their liquidity and mapped their destruction. I am not just a bystander who balances your checkbook anymore. I am part of this." Adrian stared at her. He felt a dangerous, possessive thrill surge through his veins, entirely eclipsing his exhaustion. For years he had kept her isolated, convincing himself he was protecting her purity. But looking at her now, bruised, unbroken, and demanding her place in his brutal world, he realized she had never needed protecting from his darkness. She was strong enough to stand in it with him. He slowly pulled his bandaged hand from her grasp. He lifted it, his fingers brushing against her cheek, feather light, inches from the dark purple bruise on her jawline. "If you stay on this side of the wall, Audrey," Adrian murmured, his voice dropping to a rough whisper, "there is no going back. You belong to the syndicate. You belong to the street." His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. "And you belong to me." He didn't ask it as a question. He stated it as a territorial fact. He waited for her to step back, to let her corporate survival instinct kick in and run from the monster. Audrey didn't run. She leaned slightly into the warmth of his rough palm, her heart hammering against her battered ribs. The fear of the men in the alley was gone, entirely replaced by the terrifying, consuming gravity of the man standing in front of her. "I balance the ledgers, Adrian," she whispered, her eyes locked on his. "I know exactly what my assets are worth, and I know where they belong." Adrian let out a jagged breath. He slid his hand to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. He simply pulled her forward until her forehead rested against his shoulder, holding her fiercely against his chest. He closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of her, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing against his ribs. The war was over. The books were closed. And for the first time in his life, Adrian Cross knew exactly what he was fighting to keep. If the tension in that bunker had you holding your breath, then you know this is exactly how a real Mafia romance should feel. Grounded, gritty, and built on undeniable loyalty. Adrian and Audrey proved that true power isn't just in violence. It's in the silent understanding between two people who refuse to break. If you loved watching the firewall drop and this slow-burn relationship finally ignite, smash that like button. Share this video with anyone who craves an authentic, emotional storytelling experience. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next intense chapter of their reign.